Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. See, what you're seeing is one of the differences between generals and politicians. When a politician says stop, they mean keep going. When generals say stop, they mean stop. Anyway, wonderful to be out here with you in Phoenix here this afternoon to talk about something that's very important to all of us here, but it is very important to the United States of America. As Linda suggested, I've been asked to talk about the role that Iran played in destabilizing Iraq in 2004 to 2007 while I was commander there. Because I have seen firsthand how they operate and how they operate as a destabilizing force in the region. And I believe that it's critically important for us to have a very clear view of what Iran is capable of as we work to prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons. I've also been asked to say a few words about my dealings with the MEK, part of the group that you see on the wall there, and the importance of us as a country delivering on our commitments to protect and resettle them from Iraq. And it's been mentioned here that our country gave its word to protect the members of the MEK that were in Iraq. It was the American military that made that commitment for our country. And I will tell you, it galls me every day that I think about it, and I realize that we can't deliver on what we promised. And the American military likes to keep its word. But before I do that, and before I get into those two things, I think it's important that we put what we're talking about here in a much broader context, because it's bigger than the 3,000 people at Camp Liberty. It's bigger than the National Council for Resistance of Iran. It's bigger than all the people of Iran. It's about the security of the United States of America. So I'd like to back us out a little bit and talk about what the most significant security threats are to the United States of America currently and where Iran plays in those. Every spring, Foreign Policy magazine gets together a group of the great and near great security experts from around Washington and around the world, and they ask them one question. They say, what do you think are the greatest security challenges facing the United States of America in the coming years? Now, normally they have that out by April. I think things are in a little bit of flux right now, so they pushed it back to June. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you what they said the greatest threats were last spring. And then I'm going to ask you to think a minute, and I'm going to ask you when I'm done to vote on what you think is the greatest security challenge to the United States of America today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of the 7 security threats that the experts came up with, talk a little bit about them, and then I'm going to ask you to vote on what you think is the greatest threat. And we'll do it just by a show of hands. It's not trying to pin anybody down, not trying to make you think too hard on a Friday afternoon. But I think it's important that we all have a broader view of what we're really talking about here. Any guesses on what the first threat that the experts said facing the country was? Economic crisis, for those of you who guessed debt or something of that ilk. And when you think about it, at the end of 2012, the deficit was $1 trillion, 7% of our gross domestic product. And while there's been some relatively significant improvement in 2013, the deficit has actually dropped from $1 trillion down to a mere $680 billion, only 4% of the gross domestic product. And the economy is starting to move a bit, but we're not out of the woods because our debt, national debt, still remains at a staggering $17 trillion. Now, there wasn't unanimity on this. In fact, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mike Mullen, famously said that the greatest national security challenges was our economy. Some of the wags in Washington took exception with that, and they said before they took economic advice from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, they take military advice advice from Larry Summers. Not a good thing. The second greatest threat that they saw was in the political and regional instability. And they were primarily focused on the Middle East, but they saw it in other places around the world. And when you think about it, the Middle East is in flux from Pakistan to Morocco. In the Levant, the Syrian civil war is entering its fourth year. 170,000 people have been killed. 3 million have been made refugees. Sectarian violence still goes on significantly in Iraq and also in Lebanon. And Iran is a major destabilizing factor in each of those three countries. Elsewhere in the Middle East, the hope of the Arab Spring has given ways to the realities of power. Every place except possibly Tunisia, who has actually put together a constitution and ratified a constitution that appears to be a unifying document, unlike Egypt and unlike Libya. Pakistan, a nuclear power, is struggling with serious internal extremist challenges. And it's not just the Middle East. We're all watching what happened in the Crimea. We're looking at what's going on in the Ukraine. China continues to rattle its saber in the South China Sea and to expand its defense spending. And as Linda said, even as our president travels in the region, North Korea talks about another nuclear test. There's a lot of instability going on in the world right now, and Iran is a player in some of that. Number three threat, weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear, radiological, biological, chemical. And as I see some people out there with the same color hair as me, we remember the threat of being wiped off the planet by a Soviet nuclear attack and practicing duck and cover under our desks. You don't have to admit that you remember that. But the risk of annihilation by the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons is significantly reduced. And frankly, the greater challenge is one of these weapons of mass destruction falling into the hands of a non-state actor. And I've been saying since 2007 that I firmly believe that we as a country would be attacked with a weapon of mass destruction within 5 years. And I am very pleased to announce that I have been wrong for 7 years. But it's there. It's out there. And when you link weapons of mass destruction with the fourth significant threat, which is terrorism, you have a significantly different ballgame. There's over 1,000 known terrorist groups out there, and we have hard intelligence that they are all seeking, or a good majority of them are seeking, a weapon of mass destruction. And when they get it, I believe they will attempt to use it against a developed country. And I believe that will have a chilling effect on us all. We are involved in a long-term ideological struggle against global extremism. And it's not a struggle that we can say, we're done, and then we can walk away from. And I believe that the greatest threat facing us is this linkage between weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. The fifth threat, the cyber warfare threat. And a lot of people, they know it's a threat. They're not sure exactly what it's all about, but we're significantly challenged by that. I believe that the cyber threat is real and it's pressing, and I believe that the United States is far more vulnerable because of the openness of our society and the way that we manage the internet than our major cyber competitors, North Korea, China, Russia, and yes, Iran. There were 75 million pieces of malware on the internet, available on the internet 2 years ago. And I read a study that said a new piece of malware was entering the internet every 9 seconds. There's a lot of stuff out there. If you don't believe me, when you go home tonight, Google hacker tools. And one of the first things will pop up is 9 tools that every hacker should have. but it's there and it's available. One of the other significant challenges is a precedent has been set with the deployment of the Stuxnet virus against the centrifuges in Iran. A cyber weapon has been used to destroy infrastructure. And a cyber weapon, unlike a conventional bomb, does not go in and hit the target and explode, destroying itself and the target. It goes in, it stays, and it can be re-engineered and used back against us. So a threshold has been crossed, and that the cyber threat remains real and pressing. The last two threats, global warming and pandemics, basically threats that emerge from the overcrowding and interconnectedness of our planet. Those are real long-term challenges. So if you look at the 7 threats that I just mentioned, I'm going to go through them again, and I'm going to say each one. I'd ask you to raise your hand, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hand once for the threat. No double voting here, but for the threat that you think is the most significant to the United States of America. Are you ready? You want me to read them one more time so you can think? Okay. Here's no hand raising now. I'm just going to read them once more. The economic crisis, political and regional instability, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, cyber warfare, global warming, and pandemics. All right, you ready? Economic crisis. Okay, thank you. Political and regional instability. I could use a little help here, Tim, too. Weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, cyber warfare, global warming, and pandemics. All right, there was at least one vote for everyone. I'm going to go with terrorism as the one that had people here think was the greatest threat. Yeah, exactly. I lump cyber warfare in with weapons of mass destruction. So as we look at all that, now let's bring it back in. And if the nexus between terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and regional instability is important, and cyber warfare is a significant threat, Iran is a negative factor in each one of those 4. So of the 7 key threats to the United States, Iran is a major factor in 4 of them. And I'm sure, knowing the people in this room like I do, that if we gave them enough time, they'd figure out how to blame global warming on them. But that's the Iran that I saw in Iraq. And that's what I'd like to talk about right now. When I went into Iraq in the summer of 2004, I knew Iran was going to be a significant player. They share a border with Iraq. They've been attacked by Iraq under Saddam Hussein and fought an 8-year war. We believe that they wanted to ensure that there was a friendly Iraqi government that put in place there. And they worked very hard to do that. But we also believe that they wanted us to fail in our objective to build a free and democratic Iraq. And I will tell you, they worked very hard to do that. Over time, I came to see the Iranians employing a three-pronged approach. And I've seen them do the same thing in other places. First, they worked to gain political influence by providing financial support to political parties and to political leaders. There was common cause here. A lot of the Shia, particularly, and the Kurdish political leaders had a common enemy with the Iranians under Saddam Hussein. And a lot of them lived and took refuge in Iran, and they were known quantities. Iran puts out a lot of money to political leaders, not just the Shia leaders, but also the Kurdish leaders, to buy influence. And they have significant influence, and they gain significant influence in Iraq as a result of that. Secondly, they had a softer side. They burnished their image a bit by trying to win Iraqi public support with economic assistance, by providing economic assistance, particularly in the southern part of the country. And they did it directly themselves, much like we do sometimes with the Agency for International Development, but they also did it through Iraqi political parties. And third and last, they fostered instability in Iraq through the training and equipping of terrorist organizations. And this is the one that had the most impact on me. And I came to see over time a very close connection between the Quds Force, which is the extraterritorial arm of the Revolutionary Guards, and the Iraqi militias. And we got our first hint of this really about 30 days after I got there. There was a significant battle against the Shia militia in the town of Najaf, which is the third holiest site in Islam. And the battle went on for about 30 days. We ultimately prevailed and threw the Shia militia out of Najaf. And as we were going back through our reviews, lo and behold, we found intercepts from a Quds Force operative who was calling back and reporting on events in Najaf directly to Quds Force headquarters in Iran. That piqued my curiosity, and we kept a very close eye on it for the rest of the time I was there. Where we really saw Iran's hand, though, was after the bombing of the Al-Askari Mosque in Samra, a northern city in Iraq, in February of 2006. The Shia militia took to the streets, and the more they operated, the more we operated against them, and the more weapons caches we found, and those weapons that we found clearly came from Iran. There was a particularly lethal improvised explosive device that needed a manufacturing tooling capability that didn't come from Iraq. It could only have come from Iran. There was a state-of-the-art rocket-propelled grenade that would penetrate the armor on our biggest tank. And the boxes we found with ammunition were in Farsi. It was clear. And by the middle of 2006, there was no doubt that the Iranian regime was training and arming Iraqi militia and terrorist organization. No doubt. In fact, we had such good data that before the Iraqi prime minister had his first meeting with the Iranian foreign minister, days after he had assumed the position, Ambassador Khalilzad and my intelligence officer and I went in and we briefed the prime minister on what was going on in the country, about the improvised explosive devices, about the weapons, about the training camps, and about the Quds Force presence. And when I finished, Prime Minister Maliki turned around and looked at me and said, "They are conducting terrorism in our country." And I said, "Yes, Prime Minister, they are, and it needs to stop." Later in 2006, we began to see a very troubling trend. And it appeared to us that Iraqi militia backed by the Iranians were actively pushing other Iraqis out of parts of Baghdad to expand their control over parts of the city. And we suspected this was going on, but we couldn't confirm it. Well, one December evening right before Christmas, our Special Operations Forces captured 6 Quds Force operatives in what amounted to a command center with the Shia militia group, the Badr Corps. And the Badr Corps was the militia of one of the major Shia political parties. In this command center were weapons receipts. They kept very detailed logs of all the weapons and equipment they got. And there was a map on the wall, a map of Baghdad. And it was color-coded. It was color-coded by sectarian group. And there were arrows showing the plan, which was to move basically the Sunni and the Christians out of parts of Baghdad so that they could be occupied by the Shia militias. This confirmed everything that we had been thinking, and it was immediately clear to me that the Iranian regime was directly and purposely fomenting sectarian violence to destabilize Iraq. There was no doubt. So what did I take from all this? 4 things about the way Iran operates are crystal clear to me. 1, the Iranian regime has and will continue to use terrorism to accomplish their political objectives. That's a given. Secondly, the Iranian role in training and in equipping the Iraqi militias was a major factor in sustaining sectarian violence in Iraq from 2006 to 2008, and frankly, it continues today. And as I mentioned earlier, they're doing the same type of thing in Syria and in Lebanon. Third, because of this direct role that they had, they are directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of coalition forces and thousands of Iraqis. The Iranian regime is responsible. And so I conclude that they richly deserve the label of state sponsor of terrorism that they have so well earned. I've come to believe that we can count on this regime to continue to foster regional instability, and I'm not going out on a limb here because they're doing it today in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. I believe that an Iran with nuclear weapons would present an unacceptable threat not only to the region, but to the entire international community. And I can think of no other case in which organized democratic resistance against a regime is so warranted and so necessary. And I'd like just to talk just for a minute about the MEK that's an important element of this resistance. I was in Iraq in 2004 when we granted them protected status. And over the almost 3 years I was there, we closely monitored the behavior of the MEK at Camp Ashraf. There's a lot written about the MEK, and a lot of it is untrue. I had 2-star generals visiting Camp Ashraf weekly, and they would report to me weekly on what was going on there. I can tell you that we never had a problem, and the entire time I was there, Camp Ashraf was very, very uneventful. And so I watched with dismay in 2009, in 2011, and in 2013 as the men and women that we vowed to protect were savagely attacked. And savagely attacked after the United Nations, after the Iraqi government, and after the U.S. government had agreed that the MEK must be protected and resettled. We must ensure the protection of the MEK as long as they are in Iraq and until they're resettled. The MEK has consistently upheld their end of the bargain, and we owe them their safety and their future. Now, I'm going to close here with something outside of what I've just been talking about, because I can't talk to a group this size without talking a little bit about the sacrifices of the men and women of the United States Armed Forces to bring peace and stability to the Middle East. We're out of Iraq. We'll be drawing down in Afghanistan, but this war's not over. This is a long-term ideological struggle that's going to go on for a long time. And we've been at war for almost 13 years. And we are still dealing with people who have borne the burden of that more than a decade at war. The fact that we as a country had not been attacked at home until the bombings in Boston last year, to me, is amazing. I can't believe it. But it didn't happen by coincidence. The men and women of the armed forces carried the fight to the terrorists where they were. And that security came with a cost. Over 6,800 men and women have given their lives. They've left over 2,000 surviving family members. Over 50,000 have been wounded, about 10,000 or so seriously enough to require long-term care. Another 300,000 or so bear the signature wounds of this war, the invisible wounds of post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. And over 1 million men and women have already left the service of this country. And over 100,000 of them are still unemployed. The unemployment rate for Iraq, Afghanistan veterans is 3 times the unemployment rate for the rest of the country. We can do better than that as a country. Our first president, George Washington, said a long time ago, he said, the willingness of men and women to serve this country in future conflicts is directly related to how they perceive the men and women of past conflicts were treated and appreciated by this country. The government cannot do it all. I worked for the government for 41 years. Does big things well sometimes, but the government will never deal with all the individual challenges facing the men and women of our armed forces. It's going to take public-private partnerships. And I would encourage you to participate when you're given the opportunity, because this group of Americans has the potential to move this country like the post-World War II generation moved this country because of the things like the GI Bill. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your support of the men and women of our armed forces. Thank you very much.